So every year, well, this is only my second year, but every year, my friends and I do a bike packing trip. Last year, we rode the Katy Trail across Missouri, and this year, we're riding the Natchez Trace Parkway. For those of you who don't know, the Natchez Trace is a 444-mile-long parkway from Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee. It's essentially just one giant linear park, and it's protected as a unit of the National Park Service, one of 4 parkways in the system. There's also like 10,000 years worth of history on this road slash path slash trail slash corridor, and I want to tell you about it. Now, one thing you probably do know if you've been watching my channel long enough, and if you haven't, you should subscribe so you can do that because YouTube keeps yelling at me that like 80% of you are not subscribed. But if you've been watching, you'll know that I don't make travel vlogs. That's not what this is. I make educational videos about parks and protected areas. But I had a brain blast. The Natchez Trace, basically for its entire history, has facilitated trade and commerce and communication and even warfare via human-powered transport. And my trip along the Natchez Trace will be via human-powered transport. So what better way to tell you the story of the Natchez Trace than to bring you along with me? Let's hit the road. Now, like many travelers on the Trace before us, we're going to be taking a journey, but we're not exactly going to be roughing it. We'll be staying in a couple of biking beds along the Trace, and we're going to be camping. There will be water readily available for us, convenience stores, restaurants. Also, the parkway is paved now, and we're going to ride our bikes. Most of the people who came before us in its heyday, they walked 1,000 miles in 45 days back to their homes in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. We'll be taking 4 days and covering just under 200 miles. Our journey is going to start in Jackson, Mississippi, roughly 100 miles from where the Trace officially starts in Natchez, Mississippi. We'll be traveling north, just as so many others did as they found their way back home from New Orleans, and we'll be finishing in Houston, Mississippi. It's not the full Trace, and it's a far cry from the arduous journey historical travelers would have undertaken, but it's plenty of time for me to tell you the story of the Natchez Trace Parkway. So, did you know the historic range of bison actually used to include the eastern United States? Yeah, and believe it or not, our journey on the Natchez Trace actually begins with those bison. See, the Natchez Trace sits on a sort of geologic ridgeline, which made it really easy for those bison to travel between their foraging grounds here in Mississippi. So the beginning of the Natchez Trace actually starts 10,000 years ago as a game trail. That ease of use meant indigenous people began to use it as well. After millennia as a game trail, the Natchez Trace was now being used by humans as well. Tribes like the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez came to call this area home, and they developed the Trace from a simple game trail to more of a well-worn footpath, which they used to travel around their territories, communicate with one another, and trade with one another. The importance of the Natchez Trace as it came to be used was due in no small part to these tribes. Their development of this path made it a crucial corridor through this part of the country, and the ever-expanding United States began to take notice. Alright, the weather isn't exactly cooperating with me out here, but our journey continues in 1801 with President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson saw the Natchez Trace as a critical route to developing this area of the United States, which was then called the Old Southwest. He wanted to use the Natchez Trace to encourage trade and development and settlement here, which he thought would economically link these areas to the United States and further strengthen its influence in this area. He even started calling it the Columbian Highway, so nobody would get confused as to who was really in charge. By 1807, the Trace was fully equipped for wagon travel. Stands, which were basically like inns, like the one behind me here at French Camp, started to pop up all along the trace. People were settling here. Goods and information were flowing. Thomas Jefferson's plan was working. It was thanks in no small part to another incredibly important transportation corridor. I'm talking, of course, about the Mississippi River. Now, the Natchez Trace doesn't follow the Mississippi River. It's about 80 miles that way. But the two are intimately linked. See, the high point of traffic along the Natchez Trace happened at a time when travel along the Mississippi River essentially happened in one direction. Traders and merchants from Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee would float their goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where they would make their way to the world's markets. But transportation technology was not quite at a point where people could go back up the river to go home. Instead, they used the Natchez Trace. These journeymen were known as Kaintucks, and they essentially just walked home. Thousands of them traveled the Trace every single year, on this very path I'm standing on right now. 1,000 miles in 45 days. But once those things did develop, things like steamboats and railroads and other technologies that could make it back up the river, the Natchez Trace became obsolete. It just didn't fulfill the same need as it had in the past. River travel was cheaper and easier, and people just didn't use the Natchez Trace anymore. It's not to say it stopped being used altogether. It actually played a pretty big role in the Civil War, but never again would it reach the dizzying heights of the past. And so, as I come to the end of my own journey, I've come to reflect on and appreciate all of the changes the Natchez Trace has been through before and will continue to go through in the future. The days of the Kaintucks may be over, but there were thousands of years of history on the Trace before them, and no doubt there's more history to be made in the future. Today, the Trace is mostly a leisure road. People come from all over to ride their bikes or drive their cars to see the scenery or enjoy the history. Like thousands before them, they come to take a journey through time, a journey through a beautiful part of the country, a journey that I've enjoyed every minute of. Out here in a national park with my friends, riding bikes, riding the Natchez Trace Parkway. And I couldn't have asked for much more. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. This was something a bit different for this channel, but I'm glad I got to bring you the story of the Natchez Trace while taking my own journey on the Natchez Trace. If you want to learn more about the world's protected places, maybe like this video and subscribe to the channel. I tell stories just like this one. I also have a Patreon where I'll be posting a full breakdown of my trip, as well as some advice for your own biking adventure on the Trace. As this channel develops, I want to do more trips like this one, where I bring you the stories from the parks themselves, so you can experience them right along with me. That's not possible without the support of my patrons. So I want to say thank you to my patrons, and if you want to support me on Patreon, that's patreon.com/National Park Diaries. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.